The pristine streets of Sunshine Meadows glowed in the early morning light. Every lawn cut to exactly 2.5 inches, every mailbox the same approved shade of forest green, and every front door adorned with seasonal wreaths from the HOA approved decoration list. This wasn't just any suburban paradise. This was Eleanor Hamilton's kingdom. At 72, Eleanor wore her silver hair in a perfect bob that never moved, even in the strongest winds. The former corporate lawyer had traded courtroom battles for neighborhood supremacy 15 years ago, and she ruled the Sunshine Meadows Homeowners Association with unwavering authority. Her morning ritual never changed. Coffee on her east-facing porch at 6:30 a.m., binoculars in hand, scanning for violations. Unbelievable, Eleanor muttered, focusing on 1542 Sycamore Lane. The Johnson's grass is at least 3 inches high. She jotted a note in her leather-bound violation journal. Her handwriting is precise as her standards. But it wasn't the Johnsons or any other longtime residents who truly occupied Eleanor's thoughts these days. Her attention kept drifting to the edge of the subdivision, to that eyesore that had appeared 3 months ago when a stranger bought the abandoned 5-acre lot that bordered their community. The property had been vacant for years, a buffer between their pristine neighborhood and the untamed wilderness beyond. Eleanor had been working on convincing the HOA board to purchase it for a community park, one with strict hours, of course. But before she could secure the votes, someone else swooped in. Jasmine Rodriguez, 34, former tech executive from the city, had arrived with moving trucks and bizarre equipment Eleanor couldn't identify. Within weeks, the overgrown lot transformed into something that made Eleanor's blood pressure spike, or a farm. Not a dignified gentleman's farm with picturesque horses, but a messy, practical operation with vegetables and what looked suspiciously like chickens. Eleanor's phone rang, interrupting her surveillance. Hamilton speaking. Eleanor, it's Diane from the board. Have you seen what's happening at the Rodriguez property this morning? Eleanor adjusted her glasses. I was just about to investigate. What now? She's putting up some kind of stand at the edge of her property. It looks like a farm stand. The coffee cup froze halfway to Eleanor's lips. A commercial enterprise. In our residential community, that's what it looks like. George drove by and said there's a sign that says, "Coming soon, Sunshine Harvest Community Farm, local produce." Eleanor set down her cup with a decisive clink. This ends today. Jasmine Rodriguez wiped sweat from her brow as she hammered the last support beam into place for her roadside stand. 3 months of back-breaking work was finally coming to fruition. The soil test had come back clean, the first seedlings were thriving in their beds, and the heritage chickens were settling into their custom-built coop that had cost more than her first car. "How's it looking, Arlo?" she called to her farm manager. Arlo Bennett, 67, a weather-beaten former agriculture professor who'd answer her help-wanted ad, gave a thumbs up. "Structure's solid. Though I still say we should have waited another month before opening to the public. The community needs to see progress," Jasmine said, climbing down from her stepladder. "Besides, we have the microgreens and the first radish crop ready, plus eggs. It's enough to start." The sound of tires on gravel made them both turn. A gleaming white Lexus SUV pulled up, parking precisely at the edge of the gravel area Jasmine had designated for customers. Eleanor Hamilton emerged, dressed as if heading to a business meeting rather than visiting a farm on a Saturday morning. "Here we go," Arlo muttered, making himself scarce. The welcome wagons arrived. Jasmine straightened her soil-stained shirt and approached with an extended hand. "Good morning. You must be from the neighborhood." "I'm Jasmine Rodriguez." Eleanor ignored the outstretched hand, instead producing a folder from her designer handbag. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Eleanor Hamilton, president of the Sunshine Meadows Homeowners Association. I've come to address some concerns." Jasmine's smile remained steady, though it didn't quite reach her eyes now. "Of course. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot in the farmhouse." "This isn't a social call," Eleanor replied, her voice as crisp as her pressed blouse. "I have documentation of 17 separate violations occurring on your property, including unauthorized commercial activity, excessive noise from livestock, improper waste management, and unapproved structures." Jasmine's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "That's quite a list. Though I'm surprised you have jurisdiction over my property at all, considering it's outside your subdivision boundaries." Eleanor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's a common misconception. Your deed includes specific covenants that were established when Sunshine Meadows was developed. Your property may be outside our gates, but certain restrictions still apply. This was, of course, spectacular bluff. Eleanor had combed through county records and found nothing binding Jasmine's property to their HOA, but most people buckled at the first sign of legal complications. Jasmine, however, simply took the folder and flipped through it. I see. Well, I appreciate your concerns, Ms. Hamilton. I'll have my attorney review these documents. Your attorney? Eleanor hadn't expected this response. Before I left tech, I was general counsel for Agritech Solutions, Jasmine explained casually. I still have many colleagues in the legal field. Now, was there anything else? I need to finish setting up before our community volunteers arrive at noon. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Volunteers? Yes, we're a community-supported agriculture operation. Local residents can exchange volunteer hours for produce credits. We're already oversubscribed, actually. 37 families from Sunshine Meadows signed up in our first week. Eleanor felt the situation slipping from her grasp. 37 families? That was nearly half the neighborhood. Well, regardless of community interest, rules are rules, Ms. Rodriguez. I expect compliance within 30 days. I'll certainly address any legitimate concerns, Jasmine replied, her tone pleasant but firm. Thanks for stopping by. As Eleanor drove away, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, Jasmine's smile faded. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Hey, Zoe. Remember when you offered legal help with the farm? I think I'm going to need it sooner than expected. Over the next 4 weeks, Eleanor's campaign against Sunshine Harvest Community Farm grew from a personal crusade to an obsession. When legal intimidation failed, she switched tactics, sending out HOA newsletters warning of decreased property values, potential pests, and undesirable traffic from outside elements coming to purchase produce. To her mounting frustration, her warnings had the opposite effect. Curiosity drew neighbors to the farm, and what they found wasn't the chaotic eyesore Eleanor had described. Instead, they discovered meticulously planned growing spaces, educational workshops, and a genuine warmth from Jasmine that made them feel welcome. Eleanor watched from her window as Vivian Davis, the HOA treasurer and Eleanor's closest ally, returned from the farm with a basket full of produce and a Sunshine Harvest tote bag. Betrayal stung sharply. It's time for more direct measures, she muttered to herself, reaching for her phone to call the only board member who hadn't yet succumbed to Jasmine's charms, Howard Phillips, a retired oil executive who prided himself on his perfect lawn almost as much as Eleanor did. Howard, I need you to call your contact at the Zoning Commission, she said without preamble when he answered. We need to determine exactly what agricultural activities are permitted on residential adjacent properties. I don't know, Eleanor, Howard said hesitantly. My grandson went to their butterfly workshop last weekend. They're doing good things over there. Eleanor closed her eyes, counting silently to 10. Howard, do you remember when the board denied your request for a non-standard mailbox last year? I was the only one who supported you. A heavy sigh came through the phone. I'll make the call Monday morning. Jasmine was inspecting a row of tomato plants when she felt it, the slight shift in the earth's smell that preceded rain. Looking up, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, though the weather service had predicted clear skies. Unexpected weather was just one of many challenges she'd faced since leaving her climate-controlled office for the unpredictability of farming. Arlo's storm's coming in. Let's cover the new seedlings, she called out. As they worked quickly to protect the vulnerable plants, a now familiar white Lexus pulled up. Eleanor hadn't set foot on the property since their first encounter, instead sending increasingly formal letters through various proxies. Keep working, Jasmine told Arlo. I'll handle this. Eleanor emerged clutching a blue folder emblazoned with a county seal, a triumphant gleam in her eyes that made Jasmine's stomach tighten. Ms. Rodriguez, Eleanor said, her voice carrying over the rising wind. The County Zoning Commission has reviewed your operation. I thought you'd want to see their determination immediately. Jasmine took the folder, rain beginning to speckle the papers as she reviewed them. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the conclusion was clear. According to the zoning commissioner, her roadside farm stand constituted commercial activity not permitted under current zoning. Interesting timing, Jasmine said, looking up at Eleanor. The zoning commission doesn't typically work weekends. I have connections, Eleanor replied, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. You have until Friday to cease all commercial activities, or face daily fines. Perhaps now you'll understand that Sunshine Meadows has standards that must be maintained. Thunder rolled in the distance as Eleanor returned to her car. Jasmine stood motionless in the strengthening rain, papers growing soggy in her hands, watching as the older woman drove away with a small wave of victory. Inside her farmhouse, Jasmine spread the damp papers on her kitchen table, took a deep breath, and reached for her phone. "Zoe? It's me. Eleanor Hamilton just escalated our little disagreement. I need everything you can find on Sunshine Meadows HOA, their board members, and especially Eleanor herself." "Yes, everything." Jasmine looked out the window at her threatened farm, at the rain now coming down in sheets, at the months of work and years of dreams that Eleanor wanted to destroy. Lightning flashed, illuminating her reflection in the glass, and the determined set of her jaw that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived. "No more playing nice," she whispered to herself. "If Eleanor wants a fight, she's got one." Eleanor Hamilton awoke at precisely 5:30 a.m., just as she had every day for the past 40 years. But this morning, a rare sense of optimism brightened her usual stern demeanor. Today was the deadline she'd given Jasmine Rodriguez to shut down her farm stand. Victory was finally within reach. She dressed carefully in her power outfit, a navy blue suit with subtle gold buttons, the same ensemble she'd worn to her biggest court victories during her legal career. Today deserved nothing less. "Perfect," she murmured, applying her signature coral lipstick with precision. By sunset, order would be restored to her domain. Eleanor's phone chimed with a text from Howard Phillips. "Turn on Channel 7 News now." Frowning, Eleanor switched on her bedroom television to see a familiar face filling the screen, Jasmine Rodriguez, standing in front of her farm, surrounded by at least 30 Sunshine Meadows residents holding signs that read, "Save our community farm," and "Food, not lawns." "A clear case of regulatory harassment," Jasmine was saying to the reporter, her expression earnest. "We've discovered that the zoning complaint was filed by someone with a personal vendetta against community agriculture, using connections to circumvent normal procedures." The camera panned to show families with children, elderly couples, and even Dr. Reynolds, the most respected resident of Sunshine Meadows, all nodding in agreement. What these families understand is that Sunshine Harvest Farm operates as a non-profit educational center with an optional donation-based produce sharing program. "All perfectly legal under current zoning," Jasmine continued. "We filed a formal complaint about the irregular process by which the cease and desist order was obtained." The reporter turned to Dr. Reynolds. "As a longtime resident, what's your take on this situation?" The distinguished 85-year-old physician adjusted his glasses. "I've lived in Sunshine Meadows for 30 years, and I've never seen anything bring this community together like Jasmine's farm. My grandchildren learn where food comes from, and I've seen my neighbor's arthritis improve since she started volunteering in the garden. Someone's trying to destroy something beautiful, and we won't stand for it." Eleanor switched off the TV, her hands shaking with rage. Jasmine hadn't just ignored her deadline, she'd launched a public relations counterattack. Worse, she'd somehow won over Dr. Reynolds, whose opinion carried more weight in the community than anyone else's, even Eleanor's. Her phone began ringing incessantly. Board members, neighbors, even the local councilman wanted to know what was happening. Eleanor silenced it and stared out her window toward the edge of the subdivision where, even from this distance, she could see the crowd gathering at the farm. "This isn't over," she whispered. Not by a long shot. What Eleanor didn't know, what Jasmine had discovered through her friend Zoe's investigation, was that the HOA's legal foundation was shakier than anyone realized. The original developers had cut corners, failed to properly register certain covenants, and left loopholes large enough to drive a tractor through. More damaging, Eleanor's tenure as president had been marked by procedural irregularities that Zoe uncovered with embarrassing ease. Board meetings without proper notice, votes taken without quorum, and funds allocated without appropriate approval. "You're sure about this?" Jasmine had asked Zoe 3 days earlier, reviewing the evidence. "Positive," Zoe replied, pushing her glasses up. "She's been running that HOA like her personal fiefdom for years. And here's the kicker. She violated the very bylaw she's trying to use against you when she started selling her artisanal jams from her home 3 years ago." That conversation had sparked Jasmine's current strategy, not just fighting back, but taking the battle public while simultaneously preparing for the upcoming HOA board meeting where Eleanor expected to deliver her final blow. 1 week later, the Sunshine Meadows Community Center buzzed with tension. The monthly HOA meeting rarely attracted more than a dozen residents, but tonight nearly every household was represented, filling the room beyond capacity. The air conditioning strained against the heat of tightly packed bodies and heightened emotions. Eleanor sat at the center of the board table, gavel in hand, her expression betraying nothing of her inner turmoil. The past week had been the most challenging of her retirement. The news coverage had sparked a county investigation into the zoning complaint process. Her allies on the board were suddenly non-committal. Worst of all, her morning surveillance walks were now met with closed curtains and residents who abruptly remembered urgent business elsewhere. She called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. Before we address the agenda, I'd like to clarify the board's position on the unauthorized commercial enterprise operating at our community's border. Point of order. Called Vivian Davis, the treasurer who'd once been Eleanor's closest ally. We have new business to address first, including a petition signed by 73 residents. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the gavel. As president, I determined the order of... Actually, interrupted Howard Phillips, sliding a printed document across the table. Our bylaws clearly state that a petition signed by more than 50% of residents automatically takes precedence in the agenda. Eleanor stared at Howard, the betrayal stinging sharply. She helped him landscape his backyard just last spring. Very well, she said, her voice brittle. What is this petition regarding? It concerns 2 matters, Vivian said, standing. First, a community partnership with Sunshine Harvest Farm to create educational programs for Sunshine Meadows residents. Second, an audit of HOA financial records for the past 5 years. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt blood rushing to her face but maintained her composure with decades of courtroom discipline. I see no issue with a financial audit, she said smoothly. Our records are impeccable. As for this partnership, I must remind everyone that the farm operation violates multiple zoning regulations. Actually, came a voice from the back of the room. It doesn't. The crowd parted as Jasmine Rodriguez walked forward, dressed not in her usual farm clothes, but in a professional blazer and skirt that reminded everyone of her corporate background. Beside her walked a tall man in an expensive suit. This is Christopher Alvarez from the County Zoning Commission, Jasmine said. He'd like to address some misconceptions. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. This is a private meeting for residents only. Mr. Alvarez was invited by the board's secretary as an expert witness, Howard replied, not meeting Eleanor's gaze. Perfectly acceptable under our bylaws. The zoning official cleared his throat. After a thorough review, we've determined that Sunshine Harvest Farm's operations fall clearly within permitted agricultural educational use for their parcel. The previous determination was made without proper site inspection and has been rescinded. Eleanor felt the room spinning slightly. This couldn't be happening. But the commercial aspect is structured as a nonprofit CSA model with suggested donations rather than sales, which is permitted, Alvarez continued. In fact, the commission is now considering Ms. Rodriguez's farm as a model for sustainable urban agriculture integration. As applause broke out, Eleanor knew she needed to regain control quickly. While this clarification is appreciated, it doesn't change the fact that the farm has created excessive traffic, noise, and I think we should move to the second item, Vivian interrupted, her voice uncharacteristically firm. The financial audit. Eleanor's mouth went dry. As I said, our financials are impeccable. Jasmine stepped forward again. Before that discussion, I think there's something the community should know. She held up a folder. During my research into the HOA's legal authority, I discovered some concerning transactions in the publicly available tax records. This is outrageous, Eleanor snapped. You have no authority to. Over the past 3 years, Jasmine continued calmly, approximately $87,000 of HOA funds were paid to Hamilton Consulting LLC for landscaping services. According to state business records, Hamilton Consulting is registered to Eleanor's son, Derek Hamilton, who lives in Colorado and has never provided any actual services to this community. The room erupted in chaos. Eleanor pounded her gavel desperately as residents shouted questions and accusations. This wasn't just a challenge to her authority. It was an existential threat to everything she'd built. In the midst of the uproar, Eleanor locked eyes with Jasmine across the room. The younger woman wasn't shouting, wasn't gloating. She simply held Eleanor's gaze with a calm intensity that somehow frightened Eleanor more than the angry crowd. Order! Eleanor shouted, her voice cracking. I will have order. But order was the one thing Eleanor Hamilton would not have again for a very long time. 3 weeks after the explosive HOA meeting, Eleanor Hamilton sat alone in her immaculate living room, surrounded by the deafening silence of a life unraveling. The emergency board election had removed her as president by unanimous vote. The county prosecutor's office had opened an investigation into the misappropriated HOA funds. And yesterday, her son Derek had called from Colorado, furious about being dragged into her schemes. "You told me those payments were consulting fees you'd earned," he'd shouted over the phone. "Do you understand I could face charges too?" Eleanor stared at the wall of photos chronicling her perfect life, her law school graduation, firm partnership announcement, charity gala appearances, all testaments to a woman who'd never lost a battle. Until now. Her landline rang, the sound jarring in the silent house. No one called her landline anymore except telemarketers. She almost didn't answer. "Hello, Mrs. Hamilton. This is Alicia Weber from Channel 7 News. We're doing a follow-up story on the Sunshine Meadows HOA situation and would like to get your comment on." Eleanor hung up, her hand trembling. The local media was treating the story like a scandal worthy of national attention. HOA tyrant toppled by community farmer, as one particularly vicious headline had put it. She'd stopped reading the neighborhood social media page after seeing herself referred to as the lawn enforcement queen. Through her bay window, Eleanor could see neighbors chatting across driveways, children playing on lawns that were slightly overgrown by her standards. No one adhered to the no visible recreational equipment rule anymore. Bicycles leaned against porches, basketball hoops had appeared in driveways. The carefully curated aesthetic she'd maintained for 15 years was dissolving before her eyes. Worst of all, she could see her neighbors' cars pulling out each Saturday morning, heading toward Jasmine's farm for the weekend volunteer program. Even Howard Phillips, Howard, had been spotted wearing overalls and a ridiculous straw hat. Eleanor's doorbell rang, startling her from her bitter reflections. Probably another reporter. Or worse, the prosecutor's investigator returning with more questions. She peered through the peephole, surprised to see Vivian Davis standing on her porch, holding a covered dish. Cautiously, Eleanor opened the door. "What do you want?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Vivian had been among the first to abandon her. "May I come in?" "Please, Eleanor." 5 minutes. Against her better judgment, Eleanor stepped aside. Vivian entered, glancing around as if expecting to find packed boxes. "I brought lasagna," she said, placing the dish on the entry table. "I know you're not much for cooking." "I didn't ask for your charity," Eleanor snapped. Vivian sighed. "It's not charity. I don't know. Decency. We were friends for 12 years, Eleanor. Friends don't betray each other. Friends don't embezzle from communities either," Vivian countered, then softened her tone. "Look, I came to tell you that the board voted last night. If you agree to repay the misappropriated funds, they won't press charges. Derek won't be implicated. You can keep your house and your dignity." Eleanor's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Why would you do that?" "Because despite everything, many of us remember how you helped this community in the beginning, before you became so controlling. The beautification projects, the security improvements. Those things mattered." A strange sensation washed over Eleanor, something like relief mingled with shame. "And what about her?" she asked, unable to even say Jasmine's name. "Jasmine supported the motion to offer you this deal," Vivian said quietly. "She said everyone deserves a second chance to be part of a community." Eleanor turned away, unwilling to let Vivian see the emotion on her face. "I'll consider it," she said stiffly. After Vivian left, Eleanor stood motionless in her foyer, the untouched lasagna growing cold on the table. The house phone rang again. Another reporter, no doubt. Let it ring. Then her cell phone buzzed with a weather alert, flash flood warning, immediate action required. Jasmine Rodriguez was securing the chicken coop when the emergency alerts began blaring from every phone at the farm. The spring had been unusually wet, and the forecast had warned of heavy rains. But this was different. The county emergency system was predicting flash flooding within hours. "Everyone drop what you're doing," she called to the weekend volunteers. "We need to move all the seedling trays to higher ground and secure anything that could wash away." The farm erupted into organized chaos as dozens of hands worked together. The irrigation channels Jasmine had designed to manage normal rainfall would need to be quickly modified to handle potential flooding. The road that connected Sunshine Meadows to the main highway ran alongside a creek that had breached its banks twice in the past decade. As rain began falling in thick sheets, Jasmine saw headlights approaching. Vivian Davis jumped out of her car, already soaked. "The creek's rising fast," she shouted over the downpour. "The county's saying we might be cut off for days if the road floods." The evacuation route is already underwater on the north side. Jasmine made a quick decision. The farmhouse is on the highest ground around here. Tell everyone in Sunshine Meadows they can shelter here if needed. We've got the generator, plenty of stored food, and space if people bring sleeping bags. Within an hour, the farm had transformed into an emergency shelter. Cars filled the parking area as families arrived with children, pets, and overnight necessities. Arlo organized a volunteer team to fill sandbags, while Jasmine converted her processing barn into a dormitory space. Dr. Reynolds arrived with his medical bag. Thought you might need a doctor on hand, he said, his eyes twinkling despite the crisis. My nurse is bringing extra supplies. As night fell and the storm intensified, Jasmine did a count. Nearly half the subdivision had sought shelter at the farm. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 months ago, most of these people had viewed her property as an eyesore. Now it was their refuge. A commotion at the door drew her attention. Howard Phillips was helping someone inside, a drenched, bedraggled figure Jasmine didn't immediately recognize. Then the person looked up and Jasmine froze. Eleanor Hamilton stood in the doorway, water streaming from her expensive coat, her perfect bob plastered to her head, her makeup streaked down her face. She looked smaller, somehow older, her imperious bearing washed away by the storm. The room fell silent as residents noticed who had arrived. Eleanor visibly flinched at the stairs. My street is flooded, she said, her voice barely audible. The emergency services said to come here. For a moment, no one moved. Then Jasmine stepped forward, offering a towel. We have a spot by the east window, she said, keeping her voice neutral. It's quieter there. I think Mrs. Abernathy brought extra blankets. Eleanor accepted the towel, her eyes meeting Jasmine's briefly. No words of thanks came, but something passed between them, a fragile acknowledgement perhaps. Then Eleanor moved toward the indicated space, the crowd parting silently. By midnight, the farm had become a strange microcosm of crisis community. Children slept on makeshift pallets, while adults monitored the storm's progress on phones and radios. The sandbag crew rotated shifts, fighting to keep the water from reaching the buildings. Jasmine was checking the generator when she noticed Eleanor standing alone at the window, watching the rain. The forecast says it should ease by morning, Jasmine offered, unsure why she felt compelled to speak to this woman who tried to destroy everything she'd built. Eleanor didn't turn. My husband and I weathered Hurricane Agnes in '72, she said unexpectedly. 3 days without power in our first apartment. He kept our spirits up with terrible jokes. He's been gone 11 years now. Jasmine didn't know how to respond to this sudden glimpse of humanity. Before she could find words, Eleanor continued. Your farm is well designed. The swales, the water management. It's why this property isn't underwater while half the subdivision is flooding. Coming from Eleanor, this was tantamount to effusive praise. Thank you, Jasmine said carefully. It's permaculture design, working with natural systems instead of against them. Eleanor finally turned, her face composed again, though lacking its usual severity. I've been offered a deal by the board. Repayment instead of prosecution. I know. I supported it. Why? The question was blunt, genuine. Jasmine considered her answer. Because communities thrive on redemption, not retribution. At least, that's the kind of community I want to build. Eleanor studied her with a shrewd assessment of a lifelong lawyer. You're not what I expected, Ms. Rodriguez. Neither are you, Ms. Hamilton, Jasmine replied. I never expected you to admit defeat. A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. I haven't. Not completely. The next morning dawned clear, the storm leaving behind a transformed landscape. The creek had returned to its banks, but evidence of its rampage was everywhere. Downed trees, debris-strewn yards, and mud coating the lower streets of Sunshine Meadows. The farm had weathered the deluge remarkably well, thanks to the swales and berms Jasmine had installed to manage water flow. As residents prepared to return home, many stopped to thank her, expressing amazement at how her weird farming techniques had actually protected their community. Eleanor observed this from the periphery, composure restored after a night's rest, though her carefully maintained appearance remained somewhat disheveled. She watched as Jasmine organized cleanup crews, distributed stored vegetables to families whose refrigerators would be without power, and somehow managed to make a disaster feel like a community event. As people began departing, Eleanor approached Jasmine, who was instructing volunteers on road clearance. Ms. Rodriguez, she said formally. A word. They stepped aside, beneath the branches of a young oak Jasmine had planted when she first arrived. I've decided to accept the board's offer, Eleanor said. I'll repay the funds. Jasmine nodded. I think that's wise. However, Eleanor continued, I won't be staying in Sunshine Meadows. My sister in Arizona has been asking me to move closer for years. I've resisted because... She glanced around at the community she'd controlled for so long. Well, it doesn't matter now. Jasmine was surprised to feel a twinge of something like regret. The community won't be the same without you, Ms. Hamilton. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. That's rather the point, isn't it? She extended her hand, the first time she'd offered to shake Jasmine's. You've built something remarkable here. Not what I would have chosen, but remarkable nonetheless. Jasmine accepted the handshake, recognizing the enormous concession this represented for a woman like Eleanor. Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. Eleanor nodded curtly, then turned to leave. She paused after a few steps. One piece of advice, Ms. Rodriguez? Yes. Don't let them walk all over you once I'm gone. Communities need structure, boundaries. Not walls, perhaps, but guidelines. Without them, chaos eventually follows. A pause. I may have gone too far in one direction, but the absence of order goes too far in the other. With that parting wisdom, Eleanor Hamilton walked away, her posture straight despite everything she'd lost. 6 months later, Sunshine Harvest Community Farm hosted its first harvest festival. Pumpkins and squash decorated hay bales, children ran through a corn maze, and the newly formed Sunshine Meadows Community Council, which had replaced the disbanded HOA, presented Jasmine with a certificate of appreciation. A farm-to-table dinner stretched across long tables beneath string lights, bringing together residents and neighboring communities in celebration. Dr. Reynolds raised a toast to new beginnings and better endings, which drew knowing smiles from those who remembered the Eleanor Hamilton era. As twilight settled over the farm, Jasmine slipped away from the festivities to check her email in the quiet of the farmhouse. Among the usual messages was one that caught her eye, sent from an address she didn't recognize, with the subject line observation from afar. She opened it, curious. Ms. Rodriguez, my sister's local newspaper featured your harvest festival in their community spotlight section. The aerial photograph shows impressive growth since my departure. The orchard layout is particularly well conceived. I've enclosed a digital copy of my grandmother's heritage apple grafting techniques. Her orchard was renowned in the Hudson Valley for nearly 50 years. These methods aren't found in modern texts but might prove useful given your climate challenges. Respectfully, E. Hamilton. P.S. Your new community council's fence height restrictions are overly permissive, but I suppose some battles aren't worth fighting. Jasmine smiled, saving the attachment. Outside, laughter and music drifted through the autumn air as the community she'd fought for, and the one Eleanor had inadvertently helped create, celebrated the unexpected harvest they'd all reaped from their conflict. Sometimes the most fertile ground comes from the most difficult struggles. And sometimes, Jasmine reflected, even the most formidable adversaries plant seeds you never expected to grow.